Welcome to our next installment of the Conversations on Europe monthly series, hosted by the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. My name is Alison Delnor, and I'm the interim director currently. Welcome to our panelists, who I will introduce in just a minute. Our Conversations on Europe is a monthly series funded in part by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Commission and through a National Resource Centers grant from the US Department of Education. Opinions expressed during this do not necessarily reflect our funders. This semester, as part of our Year of Recovering Europe, we are exploring the idea of reckoning with the past, and today's session is the last of the four-part session to engage with this broader topic. Thanks to support from our partners at universities throughout the US through our Jean Monnet in the USA network, I can make a special thanks especially to our partners Miami, Florida, Jean Monnet European Union Center of Excellence at Florida International University, the EU Center at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the Center for European Studies at the University of Florida, and the Center for European Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, as well as the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at the Georgia Institute of Technology. I also want to thank my institutional partners, the Center for Latin American Studies and the Global Studies Center here at the University of Pittsburgh. I also would be remiss if I didn't thank my colleagues, Iris Matievich and Kenny Riley, for their help during today's session. Before we begin, and I would like to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement, which normally I would just do in passing, but given the discussion, I also want to sort of put it out there as something that we might talk about as things that are being done in light of the movements for global restorative justice. So we would first like to acknowledge that we gather and conduct this video conference on the traditional ancestral lands of the Dina and Hopewell cultures, who were later joined by refugees of other tribes, including the Delaware, Shawnee, and Haudenosaunee. We recognize and honor them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. The land came under the control of the current settler state known as the US through genocidal military campaigns and ongoing occupation. Acknowledging and understanding the history of the land we are on allows us to have historical context of an ongoing process of colonialism we see today. While we cannot change the past, we commit to continued gratitude for the gifts of nature, along with ongoing respect, care, and stewardship of the land, each other, and future generations. And I'm doing the formal PIT version of the land acknowledgement, but of course we're doing this remotely and with other sites in the US joining, so I could be adding a longer list of ancestral lands to that list. So today's session, after doing a session on decolonizing the curriculum, on decolonizing Europe's museums, today we wanted to talk in particular about the issue of reparations as another form of kind of reckoning with the past in Europe. And it's not just Europe that this implicates, but just to give you some idea and to set the stage a little, within the past year, this has become increasingly visible as an issue impacting Europe. In May of 2021, Germany agreed, after many years of negotiations, to pay 1.1 billion euros in reparations to Namibia. In June of 2021, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, released a report on racial justice around the world that included support for reparations, bringing the issue, front and center. The next month, Jamaican officials announced a formal effort to claim reparations from Great Britain for damages done during 2 centuries of slavery on the island. And in September of 2021, French President Emmanuel Macron announced that he would support a new law for the recognition and reparation for Algerian Muslims, known as Harki, who fought for the French during the Algerian War of Independence, but who faced discrimination both in France and Algeria after the war. This law, in fact, the projet de loi was largely approved just last month on February 15th by the French Senate. This is just a brief sampling. There's a lot of other things going on, and it's certainly not limited to Europe and the European colonies. Since 2020, protests have made reparations a campaign issue, but it predates that by a lot as well, as we will see. Cities and states around the US are slowly responding, and in fact, Congressman Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas has announced that she believes that the House has enough votes to pass HR 40, which would establish a commission to study the issue of reparations for African Americans in the United States. So it's a good time for this conversation. It's the high time maybe for this conversation on Europe, because we have not had this conversation yet in our series. So I am very, very pleased today to be able to welcome our panel of distinguished scholars and activists and public intellectuals to discuss the issue of reparations in Europe. And I imagine we're going to talk a little bit about the US and other places as well. So first, and in no particular order, Dr. Claire Greenstein is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Her research is on reparations for human rights abuses and transnational justice more generally. Her dissertation, Pressures, Promises, and Payments, Explaining Government's Reparations Decisions After Domestic Human Rights Abuses, is currently being reworked into a book manuscript. Next on my screen, Dr. Verene A is the director of the Center for Reparation Research at the University of the West Indies. She researches Jamaican economic history, slavery, reparation, and gender discourses in Caribbean history, and is the author of 7 books. Professor Shepherd is also the host of Talking History, heard nationwide in Jamaica, a member of the National Council on Reparations in Jamaica, and a vice chair of the CARICOM Reparation Commission, and vice chair of the UN's Committee for Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Joshua Kwesi Aikins is a political scientist, a prominent activist and public scholar in Germany and Ghana, and a PhD student at the University of Kassel Department of Development and Post-Colonial Studies. He has served as an expert member of the Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry on Racism and Discrimination in the state of Thuringia in Germany. And his research interests include the interaction between Western style and indigenous political institutions in Ghana, post and decolonial perspectives on development, and coloniality in the politics of memory in Germany. And last but not least, Dr. Wes Alcenat is an assistant professor of history, urban studies, and American studies at Fordham University in New York. His research focuses on political and intellectual thought in the 19th century, the African-American protest tradition, and the Haitian Revolution's legacy and influence on Black American radicalism. He's written on the case for Haitian reparations in Jacobin and the Route, among other interesting writings elsewhere. We'll have more thorough biographies linked on our website, as well as to the recorded version of this talk, which will also be loaded to our website, along with suggestions for further readings and viewings. I will say before we launch into questions that I do hope that we can get lots of questions from our audience. I see we have a number of people joining us today, so please feel free to put those questions in the Q&A, and I will definitely raise them with our panel. So thank you all for joining us. I'm very delighted to have this chance to have this conversation today. And I want to start with a little bit of a sort of broad question to set the stage. I gave a very brief outline of some recent things that have been happening, but as I mentioned, this is not new. So I'll throw it out first to you, Claire. What is the kind of history of reparations in Europe, and how do we contextualize what we see happening in this past year or so?
Sure. So I also want to start by saying thank you for the invitation to be here. And I am just so honored to be able to be in a conversation with these scholars. It's really, just an amazing opportunity. So thank you for that. As far as reparations history in Europe, reparations demands aren't new, but the terminology is. And certainly the extent to which you see that in ordinary public discourse is. So when I started working on reparations in 2014-ish, people, when I said reparations, I'm studying reparations, they would say, oh, like World War I. And I would have to explain, no, I'm looking at domestic reparations from the state to their citizens for human rights abuses. And now when I say I study reparations, people say, oh, like for slavery. Yes, exactly. So the fact that just in, a very short period of time, 7-8 years, there has been, I would say, a seismic shift in the accessibility of the topic and awareness around the topic. Before Ta-Nehisi Coates published in The Atlantic his piece, The Case for Reparations, people in the US were really not aware of the topic. And that piece, I think, is that is what did it, at least for the ordinary public in the US. That now this is no longer seen as some sort of radical idea. This is an accepted part of American public discourse. I don't think it is quite to that point in Europe, but I do think that it is getting there. And certainly the Black Lives Matter protests that we saw across the world in 2020 really kickstarted more of an awareness of that in Europe as well. As far as reparations, it's quite common in Europe for countries to pay reparations. Most European countries have paid reparations, and certainly Germany is the most famous example of that with reparations for the Holocaust. And that was a groundbreaking event where you had a state acknowledging that it had done something wrong to its own citizens and paying reparations to the people that it had victimized. This wasn't the result of a court case. This wasn't the result of an outside force saying you have to do this. This was an internal movement. The government itself decided to do it. And that was something new. But since then, we've seen it spread. And so there have been reparations, not just by Germany for the Holocaust, but also most European countries have either restituted property or paid reparations, or for communism as well. You saw in the early 90s, many reparations for political prisoners or people who had their property expropriated. So in Europe, reparations are not unusual. The extent to which they are in the public consciousness is, and the extent to which people consider them for colonialism, that is something that I think is quite new and exciting and promising.
Thank you very much. That helps a lot. Verene, did you want to make some comments about that to maybe put it into comparative context a little?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Greetings to everyone. Yes, just quickly, I wanted to say that I agree with Claire that perhaps the word reparation may not have been in the public space as it is today, but I wanted to say that the genealogy, as far as the Caribbean is concerned, goes way back to the 15th century. If you think about reparation as activities, not only by colonizers, but activities which are driving the question and the demand, then we have to look at conquest from the 15th century in the Caribbean and the actions of indigenous peoples who are saying, no, you can't just come here and do this. So I want to interject that wars of resistance, acts of resistance to colonialism, to conquest, colonization, enslavement, especially chattel enslavement, I want to say that those are earlier movements for justice and for the different types of reparation that we may name now, but that was always there. I want to talk about, I want to remind us of the resistance wars of enslaved people who are subjected to chattel enslavement in the Caribbean. I want to talk about the actions of Rastafari in the post-emancipation period, because really, up to the 1930s or 50s, Rastafari carried the flame until now so many others have joined. So I just wanted to contextualize and kind of look at the genealogy and how far back it goes, especially for the Caribbean. And I think it goes for other parts of the world where, for Africa, when people were resisting capture and sale of their people. This goes way back to say, no, we don't want you in our land, we want you out, or we want justice from you for the horrible wrongs that you have done. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important reminder to link this not just into a history of reparations as such, but a larger history of acts and tools of resistance, means of resistance. I guess thinking about, I'm going to skip a little bit, but thinking about the broader context in Europe, then if it's linked so much to all of these things, and you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 as kind of maybe increasing the activity a little bit more. Do we think that governments are becoming more receptive to some of these demands with regards to acts, to reparations for specifically like slavery and colonial atrocities? And I guess I'll start with Dr. Shepard again on that one, Verene. Do you have a sense of whether it's accelerating now and governments are becoming a little more receptive to the idea?
I know that the knowledge about the movement has increased. I think all governments know about the campaign for reparatory justice. But if activity means success of campaigns and financial responses from governments, as far as the CARICOM region is concerned, and that is my concern today, then I would say no. So yes, increased activity in terms of, bawling on for justice, if you want to put it that way, and making claims. But the response of European governments to the Caribbean demand, I don't think that there has been any positive shift. In fact, CARICOM in 2014, 2015, formed this commission. 2016 sent 6 European governments letters of demand for reparation. No positive response came back. The language was framed not in the language of reparation, but in the language of cultural exchanges and how much we have done in terms of grants and loans and that sort of thing. The occasional opposition MP in Europe might make statements. For example, in the UK, we know that David Lammy and the past Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn made statements supporting the movement, but sitting governments have not really acted. And there have been statements of regret, even bordering on apologies by heads and members of the British royal family. For example, Prince Charles went to Ghana, recently was in Barbados, and former Prime Minister, of course, Cameron and Blair made statements of regret. But they think we should forget about it and move on, as friends, in fact, once said. Friends, really. There have been individuals who have made statements of regret, and they are engaged in what we call community reparation in specific places in the Caribbean, like Wales has a movement because of the Pennant family and Penryn Castle and all of that. But we can't deny that the globalization of the Black Lives Matter campaign and the image of George Floyd that was on every network inside and outside of the USA caused a new reaction and more social media discussion about anti-Black racism and the need for reparation. And several universities, have come forward. Some have returned looted heritage and so on. But I don't see the big shift in terms of states' responses that are necessary to move this along.
Interesting. Can I ask Kwesi to weigh in on this a little bit as somebody who's kind of on the ground in Germany? What's your sense of sort of state response?
I think I'd like to amend what Claire has pointed out rightly in the beginning about the centrality of the German activities when it comes to reckoning with and also giving limited reparations for atrocities committed during the Holocaust. because I think it's important to recognize, because Claire, you said that this was, out of the free volition of the state. And I would like to just, widen the lens a bit, because of course that's true for some of the groups who have been persecuted and victimized, right? But not for others, right? And so while there has been reparations paid to people who were persecuted as Jews, there has been a long history, including legal fights in the US, for example, in New York courts, where the alien tort claim was used to ensure that victims of forced labor orchestrated by National Socialists across occupied Europe then also were compensated, right? I also want to mention the history of Sinti and Roma and their struggle for recognition of the Paraimos, which is, the mass atrocities and Holocaust committed against Sinti and Roma. And I would be remiss if I wouldn't mention the fact that people of African descent who fell victim to the Holocaust and their descendants and those who have survived have not received official recognition, nor have they received reparations to this very day, right? So there is an ongoing struggle in terms of, widening the ambit of groups who clearly have been persecuted by National Socialists, but who are not included in, those who are receiving official recognition and reparations. Now, that said, of course, it's also true, and this is, I think, what you have pointed to, that the recognition of the Holocaust and reparations are, of course, always the framework, right, in which all these other debates, particularly in Germany for sure, take place, right? So this is one of the key frames that is being called upon when there are debates about widening the gap. And I think in that context, it's important to recognize the role that this act of recognition and reparation plays in also structuring the discourse around other aspects of reparations, right? Though, and I think we'll get to this in a bit, it's also interesting to note that given this, standard that has been established, now what we see are, discursive struggles around, debates, for example, were other mass atrocities, comparable, were they actually genocide? And so now what we're observing is that now that there's a whole register, at least in Germany, in terms of state commemoration, now there are struggles to extend that register of recognition and reparations to other cases, such as, for example, the genocide that happened in colonial Namibia.
Allison, if I can jump in real quick.
Sure. Yeah.
Yes, I just want to echo everything that you said. I think it is incredibly important to note that the Nazis persecuted so many different groups, and each of those groups, there were commonalities across them, but the reasons for which they were targeted and the ways in which they were persecuted. So we know, for example, that Sinti and Roma were much more likely to be forcibly sterilized, which was devastating culturally. So the people who did survive, that was something that they had to carry with them for the rest of their lives, this inability to have children. And Jews were less likely to be affected by that type of persecution specifically. So we know that there are different types of crimes committed against different types of people. Sterilization was not recognized as a National Socialist crime until I think like the 1970s, 1980s. Kwesi, you might know better than I the specific dates on that, but absolutely. Even though what Germany did initially, West Germany, I should say, East Germany is a different story, but what West Germany did is groundbreaking. That's not to say that it was sufficient or that it was well designed, or that it even had the reparative effect that people think it did. So on paper, Roma and Sinti were eligible for reparations. Did they actually get them? No, not until the 1980s. Almost all claims from Sinti and Roma, even though in the letter of the law, they were guaranteed reparations. They were told that they were persecuted not because of their race or ethnicity, but because they were inherently criminal, and therefore the state had engaged in legitimate security measures to reduce criminality. And so therefore it was their own fault that they had been subjected to genocide. The German government did not acknowledge that it was a genocide until, I think, 1982. So what we have on paper, the promises that governments make, and I think Verene pointed this out very well with what the UK government's response has been to CARICOM, is what you say does not align with what you do, and what you promise to do does not necessarily align with what ends up happening. So even though what West Germany did was groundbreaking and was progress, it re-traumatized millions of people, and it was insufficient, and it was exclusionary. And it is only over time, over many decades, that we have seen eligibility expand. And then one part that's good, right, that we now are, as of, I think, 1988, people who were persecuted for their sexuality became eligible for reparations. In 1997, Jehovah's Witnesses were made eligible for reparations. But at that point, how many survivors do you have? And so there's this give and take, right? With, yes, Germany is doing a really good job compared to everywhere else in the world, but the cynical take, and I think there is some legitimacy to this, is they are expanding as the survivors who they would have to pay are becoming less numerous. And so it is much easier now to say, yes, we are going to provide pensions to forced laborers. German pension laws say that you must have received compensation for your labor in order to be eligible for that time to count towards your pension. And so there was a big fight about, well, does paying people, they didn't get money, but they got meals in the ghettos and the concentration camps, does that count as payment? And so eventually it was decided in the courts, yes, this counts as payment, therefore we can pay pensions to forced laborers for their time that they worked as forced laborers. But that took until 2001, at which point, how many of these people are left? And the number of people that you are going to compensate dwindles as the eligibility expands. And I would expect that pattern to repeat elsewhere as well.
So this brings up a number of points that I want to address, but I also want to make sure that we get Wes involved in the conversation. And so I'm going to kind of reframe the question that I told you that I was going to throw to you a little bit, because I think this brings up issues of both kind of the expansion of categories, but also the issues of time scale, because we're talking about, you mentioned, the number of survivors who can be compensated, but in a lot of reparations claims, we're talking about descendants of victims, right? So I think thinking through what these issues of timescale are will be important, and we can come back to that. And then I want to get back to this issue of what kind of reparative effects that we intend and what actually happened. But I guess to start to make our way to those questions, and Wes, can we maybe start to be a little bit more precise about what we mean by reparations? Because I feel like maybe I was a little too broad and just assuming, at the beginning that we're just talking about strict financial payments, or maybe we are just talking about like a set financial subsidy. But it seems like there's maybe a host of things that can be involved in this idea of reparations or restitution as part of, moving forward and restorative and reconciliation. So Wes, could you maybe help us kind of narrow in on what we mean by reparations?
Yes. Thank you and that's a great question. Thank you. And I also want to say just thank you for the invitation to have me here next to some amazing minds thinking about this issue. And thank you to the Institute for really just bringing up about what I think is just an incredible forum that needs to be continued. So with regards to the definition around reparations, I think the way I think about it, first I have to acknowledge that I think about it within the context of the transatlantic, right? In terms of the relation of the so-called North Atlantic powers and relative to the African people as well, both internally to the African continent, especially sub-Saharan Africa and others, as well as the broader African diaspora. And to go back to Professor Shepard's point earlier, I'm also thinking about the Americas writ large. And within that, I start really with the modern history of the so-called New World in terms of the Western Hemisphere. So that means I start with the indigenous Americans and what they have within this, what claims they have within this debate. So the way I think about reparations is it has to have three elements within reparations. So there is the reparative part for what was broken, and restorative is, for me, what was taken, and restitutive, although these words more or less might mean the same thing, I think there's a different emphasis here. And last, so restitutive for me is a return of rights, especially essential human rights, as well as recompensation for for the previous two, right? So I think about it in those three elements. So for me, reparations mean reparative, restitutive, and restorative. And part of the reason why I place it within that framework is to actually think about the very fact that the reason why we've changed our own vernacular around how we talk about chattel slavery is to not, when we say enslavement, is to acknowledge that the people, the African peoples that were taken from a state of freedom, and then enslaved into a state in which all sense of human rights and property were taken from them. And in terms of indigenous people, we're not just talking about forms of enslavement and conquest that happened, but really in the broader collective sense of their historical experience, this is an issue of sovereignty, the sovereignty that was taken from them. And from my perspective, I could care less whether that sovereignty is defined in today's term or in the terms of 500 years ago. Regardless, sovereignty we know was taken, both in the context of the conquest and what followed it with the settler dynamics that was brought into that. So this is how I'm thinking about reparations. And in all these three forms, the problem that we currently have now is, even as we're speaking, and I think Kwesi actually pointed to this a bit, the framework in which we're speaking about reparations is completely diluted by the very vocabulary and definitions set by the very people who are the perpetrators within all these forms of violence. So for instance, with regards to the conversation around reparations and how it takes place in Europe relative to, say, the great example of Germany, which I do look at as a great example of Germany relative to the crimes committed against the Jewish people, where that then becomes the framework and the model wherein we talk about crimes that were committed for centuries even before, crimes that are in effect the very experimental grounds that then came back to roost in the metropole, right? But we have been talking about those crimes within Germany and the European continent as if they are exceptional to the broader global experience that Europe had visited on people on the outside, when in fact the bodies, black and brown bodies, were the very bodies whereby those things were workshopped and then brought in. So for me, a major issue with the conversation of reparations is that if you really size it up for what it is, not only does Europe get to commit the crime, it also designates the way in which the crime is talked about and how we set the parameters and frameworks for how one goes about getting some form of reparative justice for those crimes. And what I appreciate about this forum is, in part, we're getting together to try to change that conversation, right? And what I appreciate, this is in part going a little outside of our conversation here, but I think if you look at the way we're dealing with the language around what's happening in Ukraine, it gives you a very nice illustration of what I'm talking about here. Who gets to define the refugee? Who gets to define pain that is the pain that we get to sympathize with? The pain that is actually called criminal, whereas the pain that is expected to be inflicted on other people. And it hurts my heart to see what's happening in Ukraine. But I cannot bring myself to take the rhetoric very seriously when the so-called rules-based order that Russia is violating is one in which Russia has already visited it on other people outside of Europe. And many of these North Atlantic powers had for centuries visited on other people on the outside and continue to do so. And yet somehow Ukraine represents a form of exceptionalism to violence that others are not privy to. So for me, the whole conversation is already corrupted based on who gets to define it. And I want us to move to a position in which not only are we talking about reparations, but we're talking about it from the very perspective and definitions as is set by the people who experience those criminal acts, right? So this is one way that I like to sort of think about the conversation around reparations. And of course, I can say more later.
Yeah, and we'll welcome that. But we had a bunch of activity. I know that people wanted to weigh in. Verene, did you still want to say something? And I also see Kwesi has his hand up.
Well, just briefly, and I think maybe Kwesi will take this up, in his comments. But we always, well, not we. Many people start with the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust, forgetting the African Holocaust. But not only that, they start with, or they put as precedent only the payment of reparation to Jews. What about what France extracted from Haiti? We tend to forget that it's not only that the Caribbean is demanding that reparation be paid. We're demanding that Haiti gets back what France extracted reparation from Haiti. So when people talk about the roots of poverty and position certain countries as if they're always, on the lookout for quote unquote aid, I think we have to remember where this all started and who in the past, way before the world wars, those North Atlantic wars anyway, extracted reparation. I just wanted to jump in with that before the point slipped.
Yeah, and I have you a little pin in you, Kwesi. We want to get to that, but Wes has written on this and has written a lot about the case for reparations for Haiti. And I wonder if you could just jump in really quickly and explain what Verene is referring to with with what happened post-Haitian independence with the French demands for reparation.
Yes, I think, what's very unique about Haiti, and Haiti is actually an exceptional case here because not only is it the first post-colonial state within the transatlantic world, it's also the first example of everything that Fanon talked about, as well as the first example of the decolonized state that then is brought in to be recolonized and in many cases re-enslaved. And we know the powers that be that caused that, whether that be France, the UK, Germany is involved, the United States. And the current case that Professor Shepard is actually talking about with regards for reparations for Haiti doesn't even consider the pre-independence period. What Haiti is actually demanding is reparations for a payment that can be documented, traced, whose parties are still in business as multinational companies, along with the various government entities that were all involved in it. So you cannot have a better case for reparations than anyone, right? In addition to the very brutal act of enslavement and colonialism that were visited on people of African descent. And before that, by the way, the state of Haiti, the name Haiti, is actually an indigenous word, which the Africans, by way of paying some form of restitutive symbolic justice, renamed it back to what it was under the indigenous people, recognizing when Dessalines, who was the the second in command to Toussaint and eventually took over, was naming the land, what they intended to actually signal to is this is bigger than just Africans. It's a global act of justice because what we've avenged is also the lives that were massacred genocidally under Europeans. And to bring back the case of indigenous folks, we're talking about 90% of North and South within 100 years. How in the world does the Holocaust become the central defining element of genocide when you've had that kind of history? To me, goes to show a broader problem with regards to how Europe would like us to think about reparations, which is the pain of white people is what matters ultimately. The pain of white people is what matters. And so with regards to Haiti, you have a situation whereby even in the state of some form of sovereignty within the so-called rules-based order that the powers have created since the 19th century, mind you, Haiti actually accepted to work within that rules-based order. And even within that, they were not afforded the opportunity to actually experiment and see ultimately what a state ruled by former African slaves could look like. The fact of the matter is, because of these damages, and I'm sure this is part of Professor Shepard's point, because of these damages that were an injury that was inflicted on Haiti, I'm not sure that the world realized we have not even begun to know what a true independent Haiti would look like. How could we know? It's been molested too many times. The United States being the closest proximity in terms of an independent post-colonial state has had the opportunity to live out its experiment. But an experiment in Black power and Black governance in the form of Haiti has actually not yet been, 200 years later, have had an opportunity to actually experiment. So it even goes beyond what was extracted. It also is a story of how even post-slavery or post-colonialism, the West, the so-called West, creates dynamics and infrastructures whereby Black self-governance is completely rejected and refused. And it really sounds sad because every time you talk about this, it makes you sound as if you're engaging in conspiracy theories, when in fact, the facts are all there for anyone, pro or against, to see. And every time I talk about this, I sound as if I'm crazy. But what else could it be when we see the thing in front of us and we get modern sort of examples of the different actions that were taken? So just in the last 2 weeks, Ukraine, I'm sure, has received more in aid than any one of these single countries owe Haiti. And the Haitian state is much older than Germany as a state, which by the late 19th century was extracting from Haiti as part of that debt that France imposed in 1825. What else? Not only is it older than the state of Germany or the empire, or the German Empire, it's also much older than Israel, which had not yet existed as a Jewish state, but is now responsible for receiving the payments, the reparation payments that Germany is issuing to some Jewish populations. And yet Haiti, which has existed as a state long before 1947, did not end up paying its full debt in terms of the indemnity that France imposed on it in 1947, right? So there is, so the last point I want to make here, not only with regards to the Haitian case, but also this larger history about reparations. As far as I am concerned, not only do we have to take the conversation from the full perspective of the people who have been harmed, but actually the West, when it comes to defining any parameters of it, is morally bankrupt, ethically bankrupt, in any sort of sense of the word with regards to legal, political, social, economic, how it looks about history in the last 500 years. The West is actually bankrupt. It has no stand in which to actually preach the very values that it claims to preach. Values, by the way, that were only made real in both ideas and in flesh by people of African descent through the Haitian Revolution.
So this is all so great, but I know Kwesi had his hand raised. I want to see if you still wanted to add something.
Yes, yeah, thanks, Wes, for this really important reminder and contextualization. And I just wanted to add on that and remind us to put us into a broader perspective of practices of Africans that had been deported and that had freed themselves and had created their own states in Haiti, but of course also in the interior of Brazil, in Suriname and other places. And we see practices of this recognizing and symbolic reparations toward indigenous presence and culture in all these places. We see them in the Brazilian quilombos, we see them in Suriname, where there are practices of naming, practices even of cultural memory. For example, encoded in Capoeira, where we have different African, but also indigenous practices that are carried forward in honor of the indigenous presence on whose land then the Africans found themselves, right? So there's a broader and network tradition there that I just want to evoke, right? So just to underline Wes's key point. But what I wanted to say earlier, when Wes also linked this to the Ukraine debate, I just wanted to, if you allow me, give you a few insights into what is happening in Berlin and Germany right now on the ground, because I feel the way Germany responds to the Ukrainian situation is very telling when it comes to taking in refugees, which of course also as a German citizen I say is necessary and should absolutely happen. But I also have to say that there is a marked contrast, right, to other movements of people, right? For example, Africans moving across the Mediterranean, right? But also Syrians coming in here in 2015, right? Where the legal response, state response was markedly different, right? And now what crystallizes this in this present moment is, of course, the treatment of Africans and African descendant refugees that try to leave Ukraine, where now the Black community in Berlin is organizing to receive, and they're coming in, by the hundreds per day. And it is very, very clear. They tell us, literally every day, they tell us that at every single border they're crossing, their treatment is markedly different. And that's, there's no other way of putting it. This is clearly and blatantly racist, right? Now, Germany and Europe is vacillating about, the status of Ukrainians, which have much better status, which is good for them, and I'm happy for that, when they want to come here and settle, they're easily getting education, healthcare, and the like. But then again, there we have differential treatment, for African descendants fleeing the same conflict, right? So this is just to underline this issue. And I want to bring this home by telling you about the fact that the last week in February, we always have a march here in Berlin where we demand a memorial in Berlin for the victims and heroes of enslavement and colonialism, right? Because Berlin is a center of commemorative practices across Germany and Europe, and there's a huge lacuna, right, when it comes to commemorating this history. I'm telling you this though because this year the organizers have received calls from well-meaning white German intellectuals who called on us to not march this year, saying that in the context of the Ukraine crisis, it would be better not to have the march. Which is already quite telling. Well, of course, we did have the march, but I'm telling you this because we actually did cross the Russian embassy, in front of the Russian embassy, there was a huge crowd protesting, right? And there were many Ukrainians there. And as our demonstration, passed by, we, sent signs of solidarity over, and so did they. And then some of them came over to talk to us. And one elderly woman with a Ukrainian flag came to me and spoke to me personally, telling me, look, it's horrible what is happening in our country. And I'm happy that you are sending solidarity to us. But I also want to tell you that I know that we know that what we are facing here is something that you have been facing for a much longer time. So I just want to share with you that I also stand in solidarity with you. And then she walked with us for a bit, right? So this just tells you in a nutshell, right? Both about, the hierarchies that, all the others have been pointing out are so blatant in this current environment. But of course, it also tells you about the differential awareness and the possibility for solidarity across, these afflicted populations, and the necessity also to look at this differential treatment and the diverging outcomes as bellwethers, right, for ongoing differences in the way, even the meaning of, who's a refugee, what is a war, what is an atrocity, how these things are cast, which then really helps us to sharpen a debate such as this one as we're having right now.
Yeah, that's an amazing anecdote, Kwesi. Thank you for sharing that, because yeah, I'm picturing it, and it's really, really amazing to think about these moments that people are able to come together kind of one-on-one and express solidarity, and how we move past these differentials, because this is a big part of the issue. And as Wes points out, I actually know more, ironically, about the Haitian case than I do about the American case, but in terms of, both achieving independence in similar timeframes, right? I mean, at a similar point in history, and the recognition of American independence by other states happened pretty quickly after the U.S. declares independence, becomes independent. Whereas, a lot of that, even just formal recognition of statehood, was withheld from Haiti for a very long time, including by the U.S., which makes it very hard to then negotiate trade and all sorts of, important things that you need to build a state and an economy. So not even just the problems with the financial reparations that had to be paid or that were demanded by the French. And I actually, what I was meaning when I don't know the American cases, I actually can't call to mind if there's a similar demand on the part of the British for the Americans to pay reparations after they are formally severed and the British have acknowledged they've left. But I can't remember one. Sort of running through it. I would guess they probably whined about it and nothing happened. But if anybody knows and can add to the discussion, or any of our audience happens to know, that'd be really interesting. And just a side note, because it's sort of tangential to this. But I want to come back to, I want to ask, if we got a couple questions coming, and I encourage, please, audience, feel free to ask questions. We got this amazing discussion going, and we have had a question, a couple of them, one of which speaks exactly to what Wes was bringing up earlier with about who gets to define the terms. And it kind of goes back to our question about what do we mean by reparations. So I want to ask, one of our graduate students here at Pitt has written in, should the afflicted communities be allowed to decide what reparations look like? Can it be both monetary and program-based? And how do you determine if someone qualifies for reparations? There's a lot of different questions there, but this idea of who gets to decide, should the victims or the afflicted communities be the ones to decide what reparations should look like?
Yeah, I'll take that question. Well, this is a debate that's been ongoing in the United States, especially because we're dealing with a state that is multicultural, multinational, multi-ethnic. So when you say, for instance, if we take the case of Black Americans, which is next to Indigenous, the most prominent case we've had here, there's been an ongoing debate as to, well, what does that mean for Jamaican Americans who've lived here for generations, or Haitian Americans, or Afro-Caribbeans and other folks. While I understand that some of these intricacies may bring in some complexities, I want to sort of alert that while they are practicable questions, I think they are in part, and this is not to our audience member who asked the question, but more generally, they're often weaponized and used to distract from the very fact that whenever you're talking about Black people in the New World, you're talking about some form of forced dislocation from the continent. And yes, were there some free Black people who came here voluntarily? Sure. But within a transnational framework with regards to the United States and the Caribbean, you're talking about a trade within a trade, and even more domestically furthermore, right? So there's not a clean break from, say, once a Jamaican comes here, whether their case is any less credible within the context of African American reparations. That's somewhat of a moot point, given the fact that if you just go to New Orleans alone, you have a population whose extraction is half of Haitian, descent, right? So there's, and it's also dismissing the very fact that you've had a long trade beyond the commodities of Black bodies back and forth between these different colonies, right? So if we want to talk about the different sort of sections of who should be included and not included, we can definitely go into it. And there are scholars out there, one including a scholar at UNC, who's been doing some very good work about how to look at this from a very practicable solution. But I am also very much sort of sensitive to the ways in which both people within the African diaspora, as well as especially interests on the outside, who'd like to sort of have this cemented and segmented in ways that really undermines more than it helps. And the other part of the question that I want to respond to is, yes, absolutely, it should be determined by the very people who understand the harm and the injury and what was lost and what was taken. I can't imagine that the perpetrators knew what they were taking, but beyond that, what else do they know to quantify or qualify that harm? And also, to go back to my point, if we just use Haiti as the earliest sort of post-colonial example, the powers that be have not demonstrated that they can responsibly set the boundaries and contours of the definitions and the terms of what reparations is. Because as far as they're concerned, it's only harmful when it is visited on those like their own, when they've hurt other Europeans, or say people who are mildly lighter than dark-skinned peoples of the world. But it's never that the harm and the injustice that is visited on the dark-skinned peoples of the world is considered an aberration. It's more or less considered just a routine norm of what just happens throughout history. For instance, as far as I'm concerned, maybe my colleagues here who know more about Europe can enlighten me in this. For the life of me, I do not understand why Churchill remains some big titan of human rights when more Indians died under Churchill's guidance willingly and knowingly, and not by accident. More Indians I'm talking about the subcontinent here, millions of people, and yet we're talking about how Putin is doing the same in terms of coordinating, Kiev and all such. So my thing is, the hypocrisy is already in itself a ground of the illegitimacy of the West to define the set terms of the debate.
Verene, I see your hand, and I'm passing it off to you. And also, I hope that you may already be talking about this, but I think CARICOM is a great example in sort of how the terms are being defined for reparation. So I'll pass it along to you, but if that's not
yes
what you wanted to say, I think that would be great.
Yes, thank you. In fact, I wanted to start there by saying it's not should we, but I want to say we have been setting the agenda in terms of the demand. CARICOM is in fact only maybe the latest in terms of the Caribbean, but you know, indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, they started to set. But since you mentioned the CARICOM, there is a 10-point action plan. And it was so moving to me to be invited to Berlin some years ago, where there was a 3 months focus in different media, using different media on the 10-point plan. You know, I even had to have a shirt with the 10-point plan and the need for repair. So it's not just making waves within the Caribbean. So we start with the need for a full formal apology. And this also addresses the different forms of reparation. It's not just financial or monetary, but that's of course important. So we start with a full formal apology. These are demands. The Indigenous Peoples Development Program, because we're talking about historic wrongs which have contemporary legacies, which need to be repaired as well. Repatriation, because if you're stolen from your homeland, you have a right to return. And so number 3, repatriation for those who desire it. We know, of course, that not everyone is going to resettle. The building of cultural institutions, attention to the public health crisis. Everybody has seen how COVID-19 has thrown up the inequalities and the racism, even in the availability of vaccines and so on. So we don't have to, you know, that is clear. We also know that the centuries of a certain kind of diet have made our people susceptible to type 2 diabetes and to hypertension, all of the salted food. So we don't have enough hospitals and clinics and centers to deal with the ills, the health crises of our population. So that's number 5. We want attention to the decolonizing the curriculum and to funds to improve the quality and the content of education and even the spaces for education. We want an African knowledge program, that's number 7, because our bridges of connection, too many efforts have been made to disconnect us. And so we're talking about African knowledge program. Psychological rehabilitation, we all know that we're still suffering from the psychological harm. There's an intergenerational transmission of trauma, that is clear. And we're talking about technology transfer, that's number 9, and also debt cancellation and monetary compensation. So we claim the right to development. We talk about the extraction of wealth by Europeans. One example is that Britain earned £5 million per year from sugar during the peak of the industry in the Caribbean. And over a century alone, Britain made £500 million, equal to over 2.5 trillion in today's money. Now, quickly, I want to also pick up on something that Wes said. I suspect you're talking about this ADOS discussion in the United States. And I want to say that Caribbean people are not just modern day migrants to the United States. After many major wars of resistance in the Caribbean led by enslaved people, many were deported to the US South to work on sugar, on cotton and other plantations, Louisiana and Virginia and so on. So it's the Caribbean people have as much right to be included in the reparation claim in the United States as anybody else there. Not only that, remember that the United States traded directly from Africa to the Caribbean. We have the 2.0, Slave Voyages 2.0 for the updated one for 2018. And we can trace and count all the ships available from that database that shipped Africans using on ships with US flag, flying the US flag directly to the Caribbean. It's not that they were passing through the Caribbean to revittle and then continuing to the United States. They dropped off the people here. If the descendants of those people migrate to the United States today or whenever, they're entitled. And the other thing I want to say is that going back to Haiti, is the way in which there was complicity in shutting down the reparation demand when Aristide, former President Aristide, made it on during the bicentennial of the Haitian Revolution, you know, and the complicity of so many others. And two final points. One, we have to come together with this demand as a global Black community and a community of indigenous people, because the divide and rule policy has been going on for a very long time. Just ask the Maroon communities in our various spaces and in First Nation peoples. We have to interrupt this, and we have to insist that those who don't want to give indigenous peoples the rights of indigenous people, like the Maroons, we must remind them of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which speak to sovereignty, not in the way that people are defining sovereignty, but in the way in which the declaration speaks to informed and prior consent, and also the way in which it talks about, you know, the right to define government practices. And then to say finally that this business of claiming different forms of reparation is not a new thing. I am always attracted to what Randall Robinson wrote in his book, The Debt, from Jordan. And I just read it quickly. Because enslaved people and formerly enslaved people themselves recognized what had to be done in terms of monetary compensation. So, sir, if you will write and say what wages you will give me, I will be better able to decide whether it would be to my advantage to move back again, as you have been asking me to do after slavery is abolished. And we have concluded to test your sincerity by asking you to send us our wages for the time we served you. I have served you faithfully for 32 years, and my wife, Mandy, 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy, well, you know, I don't agree with this gender divide, but anyway. Our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add to this, the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing and 3 doctor's visits for me and pulling a tooth for Mandy. And the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to. Please send the money by Adams Express. If that is not a model for reparation, I don't know what is. Thank you.
Your mic is.
Thank you. And you know, I've only been doing this kind of thing for years. You'd think I'd gotten it by now, but I'm just engrossed in this. And you also point to some really interesting, some of the ways that work is being done to try to document and quantify and discuss what the extent, and I mean, you know, the sort of argument comes down sometimes to how are we going to define it. So I think it's nice that you were able to also point to some of those things. And I put a list in or a link in the chat to the 10-point reparation plan that you were referring to for others. Claire, you had your hand up next.
Okay, so just yes to everything Verene said. I am just thrilled to be able to hear from your expertise and your experience. But absolutely, the people who are affected by this should be the ones determining what counts as reparations. And not only is that valid from a justice perspective, but from an efficacy perspective as well. So if we look at reparations programs around the world, what ones are most effective at accomplishing their goals? And those goals might be cynical, right? You know, like we did some harm and now we've got people who are mad at the state, and how do we address that? Or, you know, we've disenfranchised, we've harmed citizens, and if we want a democratic society with rule of law, we need to address this egregious breach of the rule of law. The best way to do that is to ask the people themselves, what is it you want? The harm was done to them. They should get to set the terms. And I think everything that Wes said about even the language that we use, do you want to call this reparations? This was a big debate and is still around, again, to bring it back to reparations for the Holocaust. The German word for this that was often used is Wiedergutmachung, and literally that is to make good again, which is impossible. You cannot make good again the loss upon loss upon loss that is compounded over decades. It is not possible. So yes, the people who were affected should get to set the language, they should get to set the demands, they should get to be the ones determining eligibility requirements. Historically, this has all been done by the perpetrators, and they set eligibility requirements oftentimes so high that they're impossible to meet. You know, you have to show this documentation, you have to go to this doctor who is approved by the state, you have to bring these files, you have to be the one giving interviews with our state appointed, interlocutors. Oftentimes the people, the bureaucrats running those things are perpetrators. These are the doctors who sent people to concentration camps. Why would you submit yourself to a medical examination given by a perpetrator, the very person who was running experiments on you in a death camp? That completely defeats the purpose of reparations. If the goal is to repair or restore or improve rule of law, or to provide dignity to people, to show respect, that we honor your humanity and we acknowledge this irreparable harm that we knowingly perpetrated upon you, you cannot do it in that way. And you also can't guess what people need, right? So one thing that Peru did that worked, it's a brilliant idea. The implementation we can discuss is somewhat flawed, but when it worked really well, where they would go and ask communities, because the harm was inflicted upon communities, not just individual people. And I think that's also a really important point that all of the other panelists have brought up, right? With Haiti, that was not done to individual people alone. It was done to the country. And so the repair must be done for individuals, but also for the country. And so in Peru, where there was community violence and communities were burned down and destroyed, they went and asked the community, what is it that you want? And so they got to decide, we want a paved road to our community so that it's easier for us to bring our goods to market. We want a hospital built here so that we can take care of each other. We want a school so that our children can learn Spanish and have better job opportunities. We want a fish farm so that we can provide food for ourselves and sell the extra to make a profit. So when you consult people, I would never think of starting a fish farm somewhere. You ask people, what is it they want? And you can do that without strings attached. That is really meaningful too. So we see that in Brandenburg, the state of Brandenburg in Germany. It's just outside Berlin. They asked political prisoners from the East German dictatorship. They said, all right, we have been trying these different reparations methods, scholarships, or we're going to clear your record, or we're going to give you some money. All of that came with strings attached. Or, these people are too old at this point. They don't want to go back to school. Or, maybe they don't need the health care, but they would really like to have a new wardrobe. So the state decided, we're just going to give you 10,000 euros. And you don't have to show us the receipts. And you don't have to approve it, get it approved by us, whatever you're spending it on. And people went and bought a new couch because they like to sit in their apartment and watch TV and they want a new couch. Or they're going on job interviews and they want a new wardrobe so that they can be more successful in the interviews. So things that you wouldn't, unless you're experiencing it, you wouldn't necessarily come up with those things. But if the state shows, hey, we're apologetic, and also we trust you, we didn't trust you, so we brutalized you. And now we do trust you enough to give you these 10,000 euros, no strings attached. That is meaningful in restoring, to a certain extent, some of the broken trust between citizen and state. So I think even just from even completely disregarding the morality of it, which absolutely, yes, it should be the people who were affected who get to set the terms. From an efficacy standpoint, if you actually want reparations to work, you have to get the people who are affected involved. Otherwise, no one is going to be satisfied and you're only going to make things worse.
Thank you for that. Kwesi, you've had your hand up for a long time, and I want to get to you, and I'm sure you want to address a bunch of things that have been said here. But I also, afterwards, if you don't address this, I want to bring up the case of Namibia and the Ovahararo claims. So just to prepare you, but please.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's really a fantastic conversation because I feel like we are weaving this together and putting so many important puzzle pieces together to get a different picture on what we're discussing. I just wanted to offer a few puzzle pieces and then, yes, also address the Namibian case. One puzzle piece I wanted to offer is, Alison, you earlier asked about, were there any requests from England to the US? I don't know about that historically, but I wanted to remind us, speaking from Europe, about the fact that England, of course, did pay, reparative payments to the so-called former owners of enslaved people, right? When they abolished enslavement. And I think that is also important as an historical case, where it was obviously, again, linking to what Wes has said earlier and was Verene also addressed, right? The blatant anti-Blackness and the denial of Black humanity is so obvious in this kind of move, where then you pay the former, so-called owners, but not the people who had been enslaved. And the reason why this is important is not only because it shows this kind of double standard and complete moral bankruptcy that we've been discussing, but also because if you go into the record, you see how widespread this ownership was, right? So David Olusoga has done some important work on this, where he was then able to show this was not just, the landed gentry, this was your mom and pop, store around the corner who was also invested, right, in enslavement. And that shows how deep, these profits spread across society, right, even at that time, right? Which then again gives us an inverse model, right, in terms of thinking about how resources should be relocated today, right, and who should be the ones speaking to how this should work, right, given the fact that it shows how the fabric of European society, European wealth, and economic development hinged on the distribution of this stolen wealth that was accrued through torture, enslavement, and mass murder. And given that, I think I wanted to also add to the debate on what should constitute reparations. Of course, I agree with everything that has been said. The people harmed and their descendants are the ones who have to set the terms. But I just wanted to shine light on what I think is also a key practice in this context, which is the idea of symbolic reparations, which again should not be kind of brought into any kind of competition with what we've been discussing here in terms of material reparations, right? But which I believe also to be important because they have a key restorative aspect to them. When I say symbolic reparations, I mean public commemoration. We did speak briefly about memorials, but there should also be other kinds of redress, which have to do, for example, with the decolonization of public space. Because the injuries of enslavement are, of course, also reenacted daily as long as people who perpetrated it are honored with street names, memorials, monuments, and the like, right? And we've had a lot of talk about Germany being a model. I just want to bring in the fact that when the Black Lives Matter movement came to new prominence here in Germany, of course we've been marching in solidarity since 2015, right, with Ferguson and everything that happened. But there was of course an outpour of solidarity and also linking it to German history in 2020. But when then one of the Black organizations here in Germany put up a map that was called Tear This Down, which was a map of historical landmarks across the country where people who are were involved in enslavement colonization are still commemorated positively. The police raided their offices, saying that just putting up this map and then making allusions to what had happened in the UK, right, in Bristol, right, that would already amount to invite people to commit crimes against public property, right? So this then also shows you some of the sensitivities and the power also inversely, right? And the importance of this kind of public commemoration and the need to decolonize this, and only, of course, as part of the broader movement, right? To draw attention to this, but also to empower people, descendants of that history, to know about it, right? And this then brings me to what I believe has been a key intervention in linking the history of commemorating the Holocaust and in the context of decolonization, right, which was Michael Rothberg's multidirectional memory, right, remembering the Holocaust in the age of decolonization, which has been published, I think, more than 10 years ago, right, in English. So in this book, he makes the argument that some of the key interventions that led to current Holocaust commemoration were made by French Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. And these early interventions were made in the context of the Algerian War. So the point is that people who had been silent up to that point about their own suffering as, Jewish victims came out deliberately in the context of a colonial aggression because they saw some of the violence that had been visited unto them, also being meted out by the French colonial state in Algeria. And they felt moved to speak out and link very explicitly in their own public statements, link these histories, right? Which then also speaks to the fact that resurfacing this history and speaking out from a standpoint of those harmed, right, is also always contextualized, right, in these other struggles, in this case, the Holocaust being spoken about in the context of decolonization or an active colonial war, right? And so this again helps us to reframe, and this is the argument that Michael Rothberg makes, right? We should reframe this debate, moving away from an either or a kind of competition between memories, right? And recognize how they're interlinked and look for ways in which there can be a multidirectional way, right, of commemorating this, linking these struggles in ways that are not, competitive, right? And I think this is of key importance today because with a heightened awareness about colonial continuities, we find that many contemporary inequalities that have been heightened by the corona pandemic also have colonial roots. And that brings me, if you permit me, Alison, to link it to the Namibian case, right? I mean, I think Verene has spoken earlier about unequal vaccine access, right? And the blatant racism, even within Western societies, in terms of the COVID response and the impacts, and this is all well documented. But I think what is less often discussed are the ways in which colonial history and the present inequalities that result from it have also hampered vaccine access across the global South. And I want to use Namibia as a very telling and a very painful example. And the reason I'm bringing up Namibia here is because as a consequence of the genocide that happened, the first genocide of the 20th century, perpetrated by German colonial troops from the year of 1904, a genocide in which, or during which, the first officially so designated German concentration camps were erected, which means that the first German concentration camps were not anywhere in Europe, but they were on the African continent, and the people who were tortured and exterminated in there were Africans, right? So this war was in the context of settler colonial interests of Germany, right? It was about displacing people and taking their land. And the reason why I'm saying this now is because in the context of the corona pandemic, we had this COVID facility, and of course we can debate it has failed in many ways. The COVID facility was about international efforts to pool money to be able to buy vaccines for nations who could not afford them. And while we can say it has broadly failed, it's still true that millions of doses have been distributed through the scheme, right? So it was still important in the little it achieved. And the reason why I'm telling you about this now is because Namibia, which is one of the most unequal countries on the African continent and in the world, was not eligible to be part of this facility. Why? because there is a pocket of descendants, mostly of Germans and of some English and other white European settlers, who are still occupying the vast majority of the land that has been taken in the context of the genocide. And what this leads to is a gross inequality within Namibia that statistically moves Namibia above the threshold of a middle income country in ways that make it ineligible for the COVID facility. While in reality, it's a context of, you could say, economic apartheid or grossly racialized economic inequality, which means that the vast majority of the people who were deprived access to the vaccine were, African Namibians, right? While, of course, European descendants, for the bigger part, were rich enough to, ward themselves off the disease, which really ravaged Namibia. And the tragedy of this is, looking at this from a German perspective, is that, of course, and I hope this becomes clear now, this is a direct echo, right, of the atrocity of the first genocide of the 20th century, which now leaves its traces in the context of the impact, the unequal and racialized impact of COVID in Namibia today, right? And so these echoes are not just symbolic, not just theoretical, they are a life and death matter today. And that is why it is so important that we, link these histories together and understand the echo of that violence today, also as a first step towards recognition and then hopefully reparations.
Allison, if I may, real quick, I wanted to just add to something Kwesi had said, which is, Kwesi and I and I'm sure along with the other panelists, we all agreed that how important the interconnections are. And we all agree how important the solidarity matters. In fact, I don't actually believe anything can happen on any front for anyone unless we have solidarity. But I do think we need to re-emphasize, even within the context of solidarity, we need to actually change the parameters of the debate in terms of how we define it. Because solidarity, for as long as I know with regards to scholarship and history, and for as long as I've been alive, Black folks on a global scale have always emphasized solidarity. But there is an anti-Blackness that is not restricted to sort of a Black and white binary. An anti-Blackness that even runs deep within Black communities themselves, and especially other communities of color throughout the world, where even people who have never met a Black person already know they don't like Black people. Where am I getting to with this? It often falls on Black people to emphasize solidarity. And even when we actually try to get the world at large to understand the exceptionalism of 15 million people displaced, which continually is having effects on the African continent in terms of human development, resource of human development, right? There is a quick attack on Black people that says you're exceptionalizing the Black experience, not exceptionalizing it with the context of what it means uniquely within the global history, but exceptionalizing as if Black pain matters more than others, which is just pathetic with regards to sort of the untruth of it, and how within the Black radical tradition, both scholars and activists have for a long time, especially if you look at the tradition of the writings of the, W.E.B. Du Bois and others, have really tried to make this a global solidarity movement. And yet, there is a way in which I have noticed, whether it's in the most recent uprisings having to do with the post-George Floyd murder, or as we have been talking about, the many sort of demonstrations and illustrations of how other pains always tend to sort of override the pain of folks of color more generally. But it's especially when it comes to Black folks on a global African diaspora perspective, whenever one tries to emphasize the need to take into account um, what that means on a broader scale for everyone in terms of these interconnections that we're trying to make and the solidarity that is much needed, there is often a pushback. And sometimes that pushback is as strong among communities that were not part of the perpetrators, among non-white, non-European, North American communities. And that too ought to be talked about out loud, because it is very pernicious and it does stand in the way of progress. I've noticed it all of a sudden. Often the powers that see a good opportunity within this also do exploit it, right? All of a sudden you have this Olympics of oppression where Black folks are not even concerned about that. We're more concerned about both, again, restoring, repairing, and restitution, not only for us, because we understand that on a base scale, global anti-Blackness and its interconnections with settler colonial dynamics as well as capitalism has such a widespread effects that it covers the globe more generally in terms of European imperialism and colonialism and racism. So we've always been making the point for solidarity and for the interconnections and the comparativeness, and not from a point of all struggles are similar or that some pains are higher than others. It's actually been always within a single sort of unitarian outlook of the humanitarian case for never repeating these crimes and for actually doing something about them. But again, whatever that push for solidarity comes from Black people, I have to say there is often a reluctant, a stubborn anti-Blackness that is at the core of so many communities, not because they themselves developed it. In many ways, we know this is coming up as part of the larger derivations of racism and how it is constructed. But the anti-Blackness is real. And again, as I've said, even Black people are not exempt from that anti-Blackness, right? So I want to make sure that when we're talking about solidarity here, it's not a solidarity whereby Blackness has to sort of retreat and let others speak. Otherwise, we have to be afraid that somehow people are thinking that we're centralizing Blackness, which I think in itself gives a larger perspective of the problem that often comes about when we talk about reparations. Why talk about Black people so much? Why talk about slavery so much? But quick to have a global movement of sympathy whenever we call for solidarity with others and very much more recent abuses. Again, we have many examples of what that looks like. So I just want to,
Oh dear.
both
okay,
repeat the point of. I froze here for a moment, but I'll just let it go.
Yeah, no, I mean, and all this is such great points. I can't believe that we've actually been doing this for 95 minutes. It seems like it has flown by, and I have about a billion things here that we could still talk about. So we're out of time, but if you have just a couple more minutes, normally I would be like, let's go. I know some people are gonna have to drop off, but since we're recording, I want to give a chance to get people to have their last word in. So if you have a couple minutes, we can just kind of, if you can indulge me for a minute, and if we can keep it brief, because I know people have to get on with their day, but just some final thoughts from each of you, and we'll move through, and I'll start with Verene since she's had her hand up patiently. But what does progress look like for you? I mean, if you could sum it up, how would you measure progress moving forward? Because it's so many big issues have been brought up. Where do we go from here? So, Verene, do you want to start?
Thank you. I will try my best, but I really couldn't let this e-conversation conclude without saying quickly, Marcus Garvey must be among those who try to unite us and have Pan-African solidarity. So let's not forget him. And then I was struck by the way in which you spoke about the vaccine imperialism or inequality, the way in which the same people who created the inequality, the impoverishment, now decide where countries fall on their scale. And the Caribbean countries have suffered from that as well. And then in terms of the Nama and Herero people, my conversation with them is that German response was not framed within the language of reparation, and didn't really take into consideration their own demands. And then the compensation paid to the enslavers was not only in terms of the 20 million, which they didn't finish paying off until 2015, by the way, but in terms of the deliberate continuation through what was the scam called apprenticeship, which was really negotiated to prolong slavery as part of the compensation. Where do we go from here? We have to try to insist that the arguments which are used by the opposing side don't overwhelm us. And I know that's one of the questions you wanted to for us to look at. There are many reasons why they say they don't want to pay or they can't pay. We all know them, and we must try to push back against that. Also, I think finally we have to understand that in the case of the British, they knew all along that they owed the CARICOM region, because in 1939, one of their politicians said, "We carry a grave responsibility for a colonial policy based on cheap labor and cheap raw materials. The facts are out, and we can no longer plead ignorance and indifference." Of course, there has been official responsibility and the dominance of narrow calculating colonial interests. We can point to years of criminal neglect when official ineptitude and sloth permitted affairs to drift. So they knew all along. And so our demand is not being taken seriously. But in the 1940s and so on, when Caribbean governments went to negotiate independence and with reparation, they were denied, even though there was something called the Colombo Plan, which gave Asian people under the British Empire reparation, but not to the Caribbean. But as a former Trinidad and Tobago Governor General said, and I close with this, an administering power is not entitled to extract for centuries all that can be got out of a colony. And when that has been done to relieve itself of its obligations, justice requires that reparation be made to the country that has suffered the ravages of colonialism. Our duty as activists and educators is to increase education around the justifications so that we can have resolution. Thank you so much for giving me the floor.
Thank you. We're going to collect a ton of resources and put them together, because you point out some things that we just didn't get to that need to be a part of this conversation. Maybe we'll have a second part soon. But Wes, what's your final, how do you measure progress? What are your final thoughts on there?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think I would like to start with that from where I last ended, which is I very much want to uphold this the point of 1 second, please. Could we get some? Yes.
Yeah, Claire, how about you? Could you jump in? Do you mind?
Sure. So, I mean, I'm a white person, so I don't really get to say what progress is, right? Like, I don't get to set the metrics here. I think, my job is to listen and learn and help my students to do that too, and talk to friends and family. And I think for the people listening to the talk today, hopefully you've learned things that, if you're white, clarify why this is such an important issue and why we should care and why we need to contribute to the solidarity. And yeah, I have a couple of book recs that I think are helpful. There's a book by John Tatiishi, I might be mispronouncing his name. It's called Redress. and he was one of the leaders of the Japanese American movement for reparations for the World War II internment camps. And so that's, if you're interested in learning about how reparations happen, it's a very long process oftentimes, but I think it's an encouraging story in that it was extremely unlikely that they were going to get reparations, and then they did. And it documents how they made that happen. And then William Darity, who is at Duke University, and his wife, Kristen Mullen, have written a book called From Here to Equality. And it is, there's been a lot of discussion in this about documentation. And so they lay out kind of the documentation and the economic case for the harm that has compounded over centuries and what that might look like if you were to make economic reparations for that today, in America specifically, but you can extrapolate to other contexts. So yeah, I just think those are useful books to read.
Great, thank you very much. Wes, you were interrupted.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. So yeah, I wanted to say, just to repeat the point about, I do think the way forward is to actually put this within a context of solidarity. But when I repeat my point that solidarity will actually be undermined if anti-Blackness remains a central component of how the world looks at this history. And second of all, I think for me, progress looks like progress is not progress until we've had all the elements that I outlined earlier, reparative, restorative, and redistributive. And I might add that redistributive, from my perspective, also includes taking from current elites, contemporary elites like Prime Minister Cameron, who actually received payments that were paid to slaveholders as recently as 2014, which is when I think the last documented payments by the British were made to former slaveholders. And we've had more instances and examples, including the United States, paying reparations to the perpetrators than to the people who the crimes were perpetrated against. So in some ways, not only do I want the reparations, the restoration, and the redistribution, I think some of that redistribution should be taken back from those people if we can both document the state and those who had received, because I do not believe perpetrators should get anything for what they inflicted on others. So for me, that is actually a new component that I'm adding to the formula. And lastly, from a national perspective, I think the case of Haiti is very, very symbolic, incredibly symbolic, especially for the Black diaspora. So until Haiti has actually gotten its payment relative to the very specific history of that indemnity that France imposed in 1825, which, by the way, the United States, Germany, England, and France all benefited from. Until that is paid, I don't see progress. In the context of the African American population, in less than a decade, or in about a decade, the Black population here in the United States is projected to have zero wealth in a country whose GDP is over $20 trillion, right? And for me, I want to see, and that too has its own very global symbolism, given the centrality of the United States in carrying on where the British and others left off. And internally, if we don't see that kind of progress with the Black community, the Black American community here, I think the case will be harder to make on a broader scale. So for me, this is what in part, progress looks like. In terms of bringing the cases to the public arena, it seems to me the current institutions, global institutions that we have established in the post-World War II era, have not been sufficient to protect the claims that we're making here. So therefore, one thing that I have been advocating for is taking it to the court of the perpetrators themselves, right? The United States is currently not part of many of the legal institutions that were established precisely because they don't want to be party to some of these legal issues. So if you don't want to take it at the international level, I argue that CARICOM, along with various other people of African descent and indigenous people, come together and level those legal issues on the national arena, because as far as I'm concerned, the national arena still remains the most sort of point of efficacy to get certain crimes to be recognized. And lastly, there is also a role here for the newly independent African states, which I have to say have been disappointingly absent in terms of their voices. Not scholars, not civil societies. I'm talking about the states, the African states, where many of our descendants, in terms of people of African descent, were taken. I want to see more of their voice on the international arena, putting pressure on the European powers to make this a global conversation.
Thank you. Kwesi, you get the final word for now, although there's so much more to say, but please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just have to agree with and underline everything that my colleagues have just said. There were key points. For me, progress is also about shrinking the space and opportunity for denial and impunity. I think we are experiencing, unfortunately, a debate that is also quite ritualized. And I think we have to recognize the rituals in this debate and just, shrink the opportunity space for denial. And I think in that context, what happened in Namibia, and I think Verene was very right to point out the gross, the questionable conduct of the German government, right, in this so-called settlement. I think that is a cautionary tale that is worth looking at. So I just want to emphasize the fact that this so-called settlement is not just disappointing, but as a German citizen, I have to say it's actually shameful. As a member of the African diaspora, I have to say it is, grossly inadequate. And looking at the process that led there, I have to point out the fact that the affected communities were not part of these negotiations. So we hear about year-long negotiations. Yes, that might have been so. But last year, I had the privilege of hosting a virtual panel with members of the Ova Herero and Ova Bandero Genocide Foundation, and also members of the Nama Genocide Technical Committee. These are two organizations representing Herero and Nama communities who were harmed during this genocide. And they have very, very clearly said that this whole process was unacceptable because they were not at the table, right? So their motto is nothing about us without us. And I think it is important for the global African diaspora to take up such specific cases and apply pressure to their own national governments to join the chorus of international, global African civil society to point to these injustices and the questionable frameworks that are being presented to us as, being steps towards reparation. And in this particular case, I find it particularly insidious because, we've talked about the German government and its long tradition of public commemoration and, reparations for some groups. And now this, the telling aspect of this Namibian case is that they're using all this language, decades of tradition and language that has been developed in the context of the, the commemoration of the Holocaust is now being mobilized, right? So the former German foreign minister said things such as, there can never be a final line. We always have to keep remembering, we have a collective responsibility. All this language has been mobilized. But then if you look at the actual terms, none of this is actually happening. The sum is ridiculously small. The terms are punishing and are further restricting even Namibian government sovereignty, let alone, again, leaving out the actual afflicted communities, right? And they contain something that I feel is should be completely off limits, which is important in this debate, which is the mixing of so-called development assistance and reparations, right? And I think that is something that is key for many global Southern and also CARICOM contexts, right? Where Western governments would then say, oh, yes, there's a problem here, but, and then they come with their long list of so-called development assistance that they have rendered over decades and try to deduct it, and bring it into the reparations debate. That's a categorically different thing for many reasons that I can't go into now. I just want to mention one. Development assistance has conditions attached. And this is a very, very simple, basic aspect of justice. If you have done a wrong and you have to pay for it, you cannot determine what should happen with that money. And that alone means that no so-called development assistance can ever be, brought into this conversation, right? So I believe it's important to apply pressure and to hit these neuralgic points and to point to these internal contradictions in the Western European discourse and practice towards moving, towards symbolic reparations, or rather mislabeling what they're doing as reparations. And I want to conclude by pointing to something that I believe also has to be part of this conversation, which is the aspect of the climate crisis. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because the current climate crisis, which is really a fundamental threat to human civilization on this planet right now, would not have been possible without the ravages of enslavement and colonization that put Europe in the position, to engage onto this carbon-intensive, pillaging, life-denying path of so-called development, right? And the reason I'm bringing this up is not only because there are these historical linkages and because, ecocide is also genocide today for many indigenous and African diasporic peoples, but also because there is a case to be made for the impunity of the West, both in terms of enslavement and in terms of, the ravages of unsustainable lifestyle over centuries that have been engendered by this. And so there's this dual impunity that I believe we have to link and address jointly, because it is linked historically, because it is linked in the present, and because it has structurally violent and anti-Black effects that indigenous and African communities the world over are facing in disproportionate ways. And that is why I believe looking at these jointly and linking them in a strategic way would be one step in the direction of progress.
Thank you very much. You all bring up such amazing points. I've already said that there's so much more we could talk about, and the opportunity just was opened yet again in linking to climate change. But I have to end it. I think it's a testament to all of you that we have held on to our audience this long past when we told them it would be. I mean, it's been a very interesting conversation, as Claire said. I hope that people who were listening were listening, were learning something. If they didn't learn anything from this, they certainly weren't paying attention, because so much came up. I feel like I learned a lot. Thank you all for participating. Thank you for sharing your experiences and your perspectives and your expertise, and especially your time, and for going beyond what I asked you to do with the 90 minutes. This was very valuable. It was an important conversation to have, and I thank you all for participating in it.